I recently received a comment on YouTube, and it was in response to my VR to Polish Folk Witch with the Cottage Witch tag. And the question that this person asked is, how do you see the delineation between folk magic and hearth witchcraft? I thought this was so interesting, so we're just going to get right on into it and discuss it today. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Thank you so much for joining me for today's video. I hope that you are well and safe and looking after yourselves. So in today's video, I wanted to discuss this really great question that I received from a subscriber who recently saw my VR to Polish Folk Witch with the Cottage Witch tag, and they asked how I see the delineation between folk magic and hearth witchcraft. I think, first of all, that's really interesting that they used the terms folk magic and hearth witchcraft versus folk witchcraft. I'm going to assume that they probably meant both folk magic and folk witchcraft when I'm answering this question. So let's just get right on into that. The first thing I want to say is that I am one practitioner, and I'm going to be sharing my views based on what I have read and gathered together, but some people may differ in their opinions, and with the nature of these practices, the cat's like jumping up in the background, with the nature of these practices, taking that into consideration, it's quite natural that there might be different interpretations. And I just want to say as well, there is no be all and end all, there's no right or wrong, and so that is kind of the point in these practices. They're not dogmatic in the way that other religious groups can be. And I also actually received a comment not that long ago stating that folk witchcraft was a closed practice, which I can understand their logic if they're going with the fact that a folk practice is from a particular culture and then that culture is only open to those people who practice it, but it's completely false and not true. Folk magic really by definition is magic of the people, magic of the folk, so it is open to all. It is not a closed practice, so I'll say that too. But again, I am one practitioner, one witch who is sharing their opinion based on what they have read, what they have researched, what they feel themselves, and I can only give you my opinion. So I would highly recommend that you go and read. I'm going to give you some suggestions for books. Go and read different authors, sources, papers online, go and watch other YouTubers as well, and just dive into the whole conversation yourself and see what you think. You know, dive into that inquiry for yourself, maybe do some journaling around it as well, because I don't think there's one specific answer. So with that out the way, I'm gonna try and do my best to kind of discuss this. And again, I would just want to invite you to consider this, and if you have any further points to add, I'd love to invite you to do so in the comments below, obviously being respectful and mindful of others, and yeah, and just being really safe and respectful in the comments. But I really welcome like any other suggestions, thoughts, musings on the topic, or any experiences that you've had in your practices. So yeah, please do go ahead and expand this conversation down below. I'm really excited for that. I also want to say as well, when I first read this question, my initial thought was that from a personal perspective, there isn't really a delineation, and that is because when I think about my practice, my craft, it is all intertwined. It's like one great big Venn diagram. It's not even like as specific as a Venn diagram in a way, and they're separate. They all kind of, it's more like a labyrinth or more like a spiral. I like the imagery of a spiral, you know, that intertwiningness of it, because for me, my practice is very much like that, and I am spiritual in my practice as well as practical in my practice, right? So my practices are magical and operative, and there's a craft to it that's very specific, but there's also a spiritual element to it as well, because I do work with deity, I do work with spirit, I do connect to higher beings, and I consider that to be a really big part of my practice, connecting to ancestors, connecting to deities. So I have talked a little bit about this. If you want to sort of check out the Cottage Witch tag, I talk a little bit about my views on this, my paradigms, which really mostly are animist, polytheist, pagan, witch. And because I came from, mostly my lineage is Norse, Germanic and Celtic, like Irish specifically. I also come from the British Isles. I have a lot of ancestry in these areas that I'm pulling together my lineage, my ancestral memories, as well as what I've learned from my home and where I am, and pulling that in. And so there's also a lot of that Christian folk magic there as well for me, because I have had Christian influences throughout my life. My parents weren't particularly strong Christians. My mother always had quite a strong faith. My father's mother had a very, very strong, active faith. So I had some people in my family who were really, really devoted to Jesus and to God, but they never ever would push their beliefs onto anyone else. I did experience religious trauma through the church, but that was through a Baptist church that I went to of my own accord. So that was nothing to do with like my family. But I mean, there is also gonna, you know, be real in my ancestry. There is obviously a lot of problematic influences there when it comes to colonisation, etc. And I have some South African blood, which then comes from the Dutch specifically. So there is this absolute need for, you know, ancestral kind of understanding and healing that trauma, and coming to a place where I can kind of understand some of the ways in which my ancestors may have behaved, but also like that some of those things were really problematic. And you know, many people have had to face this when working with ancestors, and it's not something I've really touched on too deeply, because I tend to work mostly with blood relatives or relatives that have recently passed who are my beloved dead. So I've only really gone back a little bit further on a few occasions. So it's something that I'm deepening into, but something I'm very aware of and really interested in learning more about. And for myself, my inquiries are leading me into learning about powwows and Pennsylvania Dutch, because that is really prevalent. There's a lot that's understood because a lot of that was written down, but that also comes from the Dutch heritage, which is a big part of where I came from. So I'm really interested in that. And I do have some sources that I'm going to discuss a little bit, that I'm sort of diving into a little bit later. The delineation for me isn't really there, because I see the practices that I do as all part of what I do, right? It's like the Catholic folk magic saying it's the things we do. It's a bit like that. That's how I feel about it. But I can see how there are definite delineations between what the practices of hearth witchcraft, hearth magic, and folk magic, folk witchcraft are. So for the hearth witchcraft, hearth magic side of things, I am going to make a estimation that is based upon what I've read, that I believe that hearth witchcraft is much more of a modern term for something that has come through to be recognised as something that is practiced just sort of on its own, but can also be part of other practices too. So they also come together in quite a strong way, because a lot of the practices that can be considered folk practices are by their inherent nature hearth witchcraft, hearth magic practices. But I think the term hearth witchcraft is something that's more modern, sort of neo-pagan phrase. And I believe the phrase may have been coined by Anna Franklin, who wrote the book Hearth Witch. I believe it's called Hearth Witch. And I have never been able to find that book myself, but I do have this book, which is the Hearth Witch's Compendium, Magical and Natural Living for Every Day. And this is a really lovely book, and it's very practical. It has got a lot of natural magical recipes for the home. So it has over 200 food and drink recipes, more than 100 bath and beauty recipes, more than 35 home good recipes, 20 essential oil blends and home remedies, plus magical wisdom and practical tips. So if you can think about the home remedies side of it, it says herbal magic. This absolutely also brings in those influences from folk magic. So I would like to posit that hearth witchcraft is almost like a contemporary neo-pagan offshoot area that can be considered part of folk magic, folk witchcraft, if you will. Hearth witchcraft, by its nature, brings together elements of what a green witch is known for and what a kitchen witch is known for, and any practices that involve the home, the hearth. The hearth was considered to be like the center of the home because it's where the heat source was, right? And that is generally where things would be cooked and where people would live, because that's where the heat would be. The water would be heated there. Like, that is where everything would happen in the home, and that would be the heart of the home. So you would often have deities such as Hestia, the goddess of the hearth, who would be venerated in that space. People may have had like a shrine or a space dedicated to a certain deity, or even working with benevolent fae within the house spirits such as brownies, etc., to help support the health and well-being of the home, and therefore by extension the people living within the home, right? And it's a protective, operative magic, but also to draw in blessings. So a hearth witch might be practicing kitchen witchcraft, cooking, making at the hearth, soups and broths and stews and breads and cakes. So this is often something we see with contemporary witches today, contemporary pagans. I mean, something I do, a lot of kitchen witchery. You'll have seen some recipes on my channel. And green witchcraft as well, so incorporating herbs and plants, whether fresh or dried, into your home remedies. So maybe making poultices, making oils, making salves, making tinctures, making all kinds of home remedies such as fire cider, which again, I do incorporate a lot of that into my craft. So a lot of what I do can be seen as green witchcraft, kitchen witchcraft, hearth witchcraft by extension. And there is also this term cottage witch as well, which again I feel is very intertwined with these practices, or house witch. There's the book House Witch. I have most of the books by Erin Murphy Hiscock. There's the Green Witch there. I do have House Witchcraft too. So there are many popular books at the moment about green witchcraft, plant magic, hearth witchcraft, cottage witchery, house witchery, kitchen witchery. I've got a lot of books here. The Kitchen Witch by Soraya, The Magical Household by Scott Cunningham, The Green Witch by Erin Murphy Hiscock. There's House Witch by Erin Murphy Hiscock. Can't see where that is, but that is here. These are all books that I've read, and there's the House Witch. There's Cottage Witchery here by Ellen Duggan. This is a slightly older book. It is a lovely book. Again, like there's lots and lots of kind of seasonal remedies and things. I wouldn't say this is quite as extensive as Anna Franklin's book, but it is a really nice one to have. It's a slightly older book, I think maybe early 2000s. This one came out. Yes, 2005. So this came out in 2005, so it's slightly older, and I think that it does still have quite a lot of that Wiccan influence. But again, there's a lot of what you could consider hearth witchcraft, kitchen witchery, green witchery involved in Wicca. And as many of you may know and may have experienced yourself as I did, there was a sort of point in time in the 90s when it was kind of synonymous with many people, because that's what a lot of the books said, and it all kind of converged into one. And it's so much nicer now that it's a lot clearer that Wicca is a specific religious practice. So you might be doing all of these things, even though you may resonate with some of the structures of the rituals, you may not have an affinity with some of the elements of the rituals that are brought in, for instance, with reference to the god and the goddess, and the ritual side of things, the casting of the circle, and all of those Wiccan elements that were very prevalent in some of these earlier books. I will also say I did enjoy The Green Witch and The House Witch by Erin Murphy Hiscock. I think they're okay books for beginners. I wouldn't really recommend them though, because I think the information is in other books and perhaps delivered in a better way. They're very beginner. So, you know, if you can get them like at the works or whatever, and they're fairly inexpensive, do. And they're very popular. There's some nice little nuggets of wisdom in there, but they are very basic books. There is a blog that I found called Naturally Modern Witch, and it goes into an article about what is a hearth witch. And I'll quote here: "She is both the wild and the wise woman." So again, it taps into the spirit of that wise woman, cunning woman in the village, who would have had all these herbal remedies to offer to members of the community, the village, when they needed support. So many of these little villages didn't have doctors, because the doctors would have been in the cities. So it was down to these wise women and folk healers to support the community in that way. One thing I also thought that was interesting about this blog is that they quoted John O'Donoghue from the Anam Cara, the Book of Celtic Wisdom, and the quote reads as follows: "When you learn to love and let yourself be loved, you come home to the hearth of your own spirit. You are warm and sheltered. You are completely at one in the house of your own longing and belonging." And I thought that was really beautiful, and it actually makes a lot of sense that the hearth was such an important part of our household. And it is actually a really nice thing that there is this term for contemporary pagans. If you are looking for a more contemporary book about hearth witchcraft, you might want to look into this one. This is The Scent of Lemon and Rosemary by Rachel Henderson. I was working domestic magic with Hestia, so I think this is a nice choice. And so what I would posit is that folk witchcraft could be like the umbrella, and hearth witchcraft could be either within that or standing alone, depending on what your practice is. If you consider yourself to be practicing a folk witchcraft practice or not. So I do think that they, kind of like a Venn diagram, could be one on their own, or they could also kind of come together. So they overlap, and it's within that space where you decide. I think I would probably imagine that many folk practitioners are practicing some form of hearth magic, whether or not that goes into something like kitchen witchery or not. If they're using folkloric protection charms in their home, that would probably be classified as hearth witchcraft. So you can see how they come together. And then I would also like to suggest that anyone who is performing kitchen witchery in their home and using herbs to craft a herbal remedy like fire cider, for instance, that is also a form of folkloric magic, because a lot of the herbal remedies and herbal lore is folkloric and comes from that. So again, I would like to suggest that they are standalone but also within one another. But I also do think that folk magic, folk witchcraft is a bigger, a larger chunk and more of an umbrella than the hearth witchcraft element. So it's both one and neither, and all and the same and none, and it is a melting pot, it is a contradiction, it is a complex simplicity that I am dancing around the topic of today. Now we've talked about hearth witchcraft, let's go into a little bit more about folk witchcraft, which for me feels broader, bigger, lots to go into. So I think if you are interested in learning about folk witchcraft, folk magic, a good place to start is this book, Folk Witchcraft, A Guide to Loreland, The Familiar Spirit for the Solitary Practitioner by Roger J. Horne. Roger J. Horne starts by discussing what folk magic, folk witchcraft is, but then also goes into detail about some of the older texts that you may wish to dive into to learn more, because the lore is where the magic is and where you can start to bring some of those elements into your own practice and actually craft a practice that is your own. So as well as having a number of charms listed in the book and different rituals and practices, there is that just golden nugget where Roger J. Horne lists some of the different texts. Reginald Scott's The Discovery of Witchcraft, for instance, Compendium Maleficarum, Charles Godfrey Leland's Aradia, or Gospel of the Witches, Nicholas Culpeper's Complete Herbal, Robert Kirk's The Secret Commonwealth of Fairies, The Golden Bough by James Fraser, Plant Lore, Legends, Lyrics by Richard Folkard. There are also a number of books that you may wish to kind of gather and collect by herbalists, botanists, folkloric herbalists who have collected the lore over time, and they sort of provide a catalogue or a compendium, if you will, of some of those older charms that they've collected together. A prime example of that is this book, The Wicked Shah Decay, Charms, Spells and Witchcraft of Old Britain by A.D. Mercer. This is like an edited version, a compilation of historical enchantments against foul spirits and maledictions. So these are charms that are from different areas, and it breaks down which areas the charms come from, and it has different ways that these were cast, and it's all been collected from a number of different older ancient texts and grimoires, and it lists as well which grimoire. There's a very specific sort of way that you index it. There's a code to each charm so you can find out which text it was from. So it's kind of like this, it's almost like a little catalogue that you can dip in and out of. I actually used this just the other day for a charm, and it's really, really handy to have. It's just like essential to have this kind of pocket guide, if you will. That said, I would like to go into a little bit about what Roger J. Horne discusses when they unpack the phrase folk witchcraft. I offer this term as a way to distinguish the manner of approach described in this book, and as a way to emphasise the role of older lore over witchcraft customs and traditions founded after the popular witchcraft boom of the 50s and the 60s. So Wicca is the most prominent of these traditions. So Wicca would have drawn upon some of this folklore. Folk witchcraft, as I define it here, properly falls within the practices and beliefs popularly referred to as traditional craft. And this is why the two as well come together, and I do think maybe I should do a video about traditional witchcraft versus folk witchcraft. And I did do a video a few years ago about books that you can begin dipping your toes into to read about these, because I do believe, again, they come together, but they are also separate. But there are, again, distinctions. So I would suggest Kelden's The Crooked Path for Traditional Witchcraft is a good book to start with, and then Gemma Gary's Traditional Witchcraft, Cornish Book of Ways, and then exploring a lot of the titles from Troy books is a great way to go for traditional witchcraft and folk witchcraft as well. So then what Roger J. Horne does emphasise here is the difficulty with the word traditional, because it implies a cohesive, organised and survived practice. I believe it also implies some kind of rigid set of rules, which is not specific, unless you are going into a specific tradition of traditional witchcraft, such as The Clan of Tubal Cain by Robert Cochrane, or I believe Shani Oates is now a priestess of the Clan of Tubal Cain as well. So there's that specific tradition. There is also the Sabbatic Witchcraft, and Andrew Chumbley, I believe, was the magister of that group. And more recently, there is Lorelei Black's The Red Thread Academy as well, which you can very, very easily get your hands on the syllabus for that and start working through that, which is something I would really like to do, actually. Something that I would be really interested to do, to sort of follow a tradition and get stuck in that way. But yeah, there are a number of traditions, and in those traditions, those specific traditions, a little bit like Wicca, but not, because again, not religious in the way that Wicca is classified as, but it's a tradition within itself, and therefore there are particular ways of doing things. However, traditional craft, just as it is, not necessarily following a specific lineage or tradition, such as the Clan of Tubal Cain or the Red Thread Academy, it's misleading, is what Roger J. Horne is getting at. It's misleading that the word traditional implies cohesive, organised, survived, and what I would also add to as rigid rules or dogmas. It's inherently misleading that this word kind of implies this. It says all modern witchcraft entails some degree of reconstruction. Okay, and that's really important. Folk witchcraft provides the framework for independent exploration and development in the craft as recorded in our old law, without the shackles of laws and conventions imposed by a modern group's perspective. So in a sense, if you are creating a new tradition based on folklore, it is in a sense a contradiction in terms, but you can create a new tradition without having those rigid dogmatic rules and without sort of pushing upon others. And I believe that's what the Red Thread Academy is sort of like, because it is open to all, you know, and it's not closed in that way. But there is a tradition there, and you do kind of have to learn it, and that's kind of down to the practitioner. So again, it's kind of, there's no concrete answer. It's a very kind of nuanced answer here, and that is why, again, it's really open to interpretation. And again, lots of people might have other ways in which they would interpret what they've read and what they've understood than I would. So again, like, I'd love to hear your thoughts below and just continue to discuss and keep it, you know, kind and respectful. Roger J. Horne actually quotes Andrew Chumbley here, who famously wrote, "If you call upon the gods and they answer, who is there to oppose or challenge the integrity of your path?" And again, that keeps the door open for personal gnosis. And I know there's the discussion about personal gnosis. Why do we have to frame it as personal gnosis? Surely that's baked into the word, but then we have to use that phrase so people who are quite gatekeepy don't get upset that there is some form of cultural appropriation going on. So again, it's very, very mixed, and there are so many nuanced layers to this discussion, and it's really highly complex. So I would also like to go into discussing a little bit more about where my inquiry is leading me recently, and that is along these lines. So this is about Powwow. This is the long lost friend and 19th century American grimoire. It says, "You're holding in your hands the most famous book of magic written in America." This is obviously a newer print. This is edited by Daniel Harms, and it's a Llewellyn, and it's got the German as well as the English translation. This is from 1820 near Reading, Pennsylvania, under the German title De lang verborgen Freund. This text is under the work of the immigrant Johann Georg Hoffmann, who I believe essentially was religious themselves, but they created a collection of traditional folk magic of Pennsylvania Dutch customs and power healers that could be utilised by anyone. However, there is quite a discourse around this within Powwow and Pennsylvania Dutch communities. The idea that actually the folk magic part of it, belief is kind of a tool for magic. So the belief is sort of almost assumed, and actually Mark Stavish has discussed this, that folk magic is the magic of the people based on faith and superstition and application of formulas that work and reused and are reused again and again. So essentially the faith and the belief is what's really important. That's what makes the magic happen. That's what there's a tendency toward believing in the discourse around this topic, right? That when you read a psalm or a prayer from a folk charm, you are calling on Jesus, God, Mary, Holy Spirit to heal, to bless, to protect, and the belief is kind of inherent. I've also learned from my reading that there was a tendency for the workings to be extremely successful on children or on animals, and the reasoning for that was believed to be because children and animals were inherently innocent, and it didn't really matter if they understood what was happening, as long as the powwow or folk healer was able to make that prayer for them, with them, to perform that charm, they would be highly successful. And if someone were to come to a powwower with something that needed healed, but they didn't have a faith that it could be tried, they could try it, but it might not necessarily be as successful. And so I think that that is really, really interesting. And obviously we're going to a specific cultural interpretation and application of folk magic when we talk about Pennsylvania Dutch, when we talk about Dutch folk magic and folkloric customs, and specifically this text. But I find it highly interesting because it is related to me and my ancestry, and it's something that is an area of inquiry for me and something that I'm just getting my feet wet with. So I think that that's all really, really interesting, but I do think that there probably are quite a lot of folk healers, folk charmers, herbalists who work folk herb charms, etc. today, who are also like magical practitioners as well, who would argue against the need for belief for the charms and the healing remedies to actually work. So for me, I do have a faith, I do have a belief. I was raised within, as I said, Christianity, and it was something I never really related to when it was Church of England. And then I did build quite a connection with Jesus when I was in the Baptist church, but it was just the people, the dogma, the institutions, the systems that were really oppressive, repressive, and genuinely extremely toxic, and I could not stay within that. Although my relationship to Jesus and the Holy Spirit has always remained strong. And I've also built my connection to Mother Mary as well as Mary Magdalene over the years. So I have those connections to those higher beings, as well as having connections to other deities such as the Morrigan, such as Lilith, such as Hecate. So that's why I do consider myself to be a polytheist, but I also consider that the power of the Psalms works incredibly for me. When I work a very, very simple working with a candle and a petition, and I read a psalm, it is so, so powerful. It often manifests very, very quickly and with the results that I am looking for. And so for me, belief as a tool works because I have that belief inherent, but I do think that folk magic should be something that can be utilised by all, whether there is a religious faith and belief system there or not. That is my personal belief, that it should be open to all, whether or not there is a faith or a belief. So just because I have that within me and I find that helps for my practice, it does not mean to say that other people need that. So if you are someone out there who is a folk practitioner, a folk witch, but you don't have that connection to spirit, you don't have a belief in a deity, or perhaps you have connections to pagan deities, but the connection to the church, Christianity, to any of those deities or beings, spirits, angels, is problematic for you, I still think that you can work in these ways, because that's where we came from. Remember, before the rise of Christianity, there was paganism. That's where we began. So I don't believe that you need to have faith in God or Jesus, the Christian God, or anything to that effect in order to make your magic work. And I would also add as well, in case it's not clear, that occasionally I utilise my faith in a Christian deity as a tool, but I also use my faith in my pagan deities as well as a tool. And not just as a tool, you know, I highly respect and honour their time, and my heart feels so full. Last night I honoured Lilith and felt this blossoming within my heart and my womb space, because I've been doing a lot of womb work with Lilith, and just the gratitude I felt, you know, making blood offerings, making offerings of incense, etc. It is such a powerful practice, and I feel so honoured to be able to connect and work with these deities. So I have both of those going on, and if that makes somebody uncomfortable, that is absolutely fine, but I am my own practitioner and this is the way I work, and so there isn't going to be anybody who can tell me what I can and cannot do. I will also say that, and if there is any trolling of any kind, whether it comes from someone who is against Christianity or someone who is for Christianity and against paganism, I don't care. Like, I'm going to shut down anything like that, because this is a safe space for me and it should be a safe space for everybody else. I really, really do believe that wherever you're coming at your practice from, whether that be with a faith of some kind, with a spiritual faith, a kind of agnostic, an atheist perspective, or a Christian perspective, or a Wiccan perspective, or a polytheist or monotheist perspective, hard polytheist, soft polytheist, whatever. I believe that you should be able to practice whatever witchcraft you wish to practice, or folk magic you wish to practice, or hearth magic you wish to practice. I believe that it's open to all. So just because I'm highlighting that this was something that was kind of in my learnings around this, I don't necessarily believe it's true. I think it's just something interesting to note, and definitely something that Mark Stavish has written about. That's not necessarily to suggest that they believe that themselves, though. I am not sure. Within the scope of powwowing Dutch folk magic, you do have these concept of faith, hope and charity, as well as the different iterations of love. So eros, philos and agape. Eros being the love of seduction, attraction, sensuality, desire, and philos, which is more of a brotherly concern for others and welfare, and agape, which is more of a spiritual connection to deity, that kind of love. There is also mention here of Sophia, the divine wisdom, the Holy Spirit, and that interconnectedness with everything. So again, the reiteration of animism. So there's a lot that goes into that, but the folk magic, whilst the definition that I have read about from Mark Stavish includes faith and belief and superstition and an application of a formula that works and is believed in, there is also the principle of sympathetic magic, because symbolism is used. So I have lost one of my files, so I'm going to have to refilm a section, which is really, really thoroughly annoying. So I think where I got to was discussing an example of a sympathetic folk charm, maybe Wortcunning or Wart charming. So essentially there are a number of different folk charms from different regions, such as these listed in the Wicked Child Decay, as well as in traditional witchcraft from Gemma Gary, which is Cornish, and a number of these different folk charms that show you how you can use sympathetic magic to remove a wart. So this is something that I actually learned from my mum when I was really young, although it didn't involve any items as such. You can. So you can use a potato to touch the wart against and then bury the potato, and then the potato rots, and as the potato rots, the wart is transferred to the potato and then rots away as well. So there's also a charm with a red thread around the wart, and there are different ways, different charms, different prayers that are spoken, and these can be found in a number of different texts, such as I've said, Gemma Gary's, or in the Wicked Child Decay. There is one here in this little pamphlet, which is a book from the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic, and this includes some charms from the museum stuff, as well as some written by Cecil Williamson. And there is a charm in here to remove a wart or a spot, and it is literally just a charm that you speak over the area. There are of course prayers as well, and this is an example of some of the folk healing that was used quite often within the British Isles, and also an example of the sympathetic form of magic. I would also say as well that there are ways in which these charms can be banefully used, so that they can be used to actually pass the wart or malediction or illness on to somebody else, which I wouldn't attempt, I don't think. And yeah, when I've used them before myself, it's not something that I've done. Really, really highly interesting. And I would say as well, you can see such charms listed and shown within the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic in Boscastle. So I'd highly recommend a visit if you haven't been. I'd also like to share this book with you, which I've not read yet. This is Magical House Protection, Archaeology of Counter Witchcraft by Brian Hoggard. I believe this is quite in-depth, but essentially including apotropaic charms of protection and including different areas in which these are listed. So there are quite a few from Devon that were found. So here is an example that I've just gone to. Fleur Fox reported in March 2016 that when volunteering with the stonemasons in Exeter Cathedral, she saw a large hexafoil design. In 1951, the skeleton of a cat was discovered buried from the ash lime floor of the Churchgate house. George Nimpton from Pennick, 1995. Ivan Byrne adds the reference for this as report transactions of the Devonshire Association for Advancement of Science and Literature and Art. So I believe this book, there are sections of it where you can read a whole section of it, and then there are case studies, and then the rest of the book is finds gazetteer, which is almost again like a collection of these findings. So you could look to a specific area, so with Staffordshire here, Suffolk, and all of the different reportings of this finding. So that's probably what I'm going to do. I'm probably going to read the first half of the book as a book in itself, and then the rest dip in and out of, and especially focusing on those charms in Devon and the West Country. We've talked quite extensively about the powwowing, about the Dutch folk magic, Pennsylvania Dutch folk powwowing, and the beliefs that come from that, which is quite specific. But let's also talk about other areas of folk magic, because of course they come from all kinds of areas, and primarily I've been looking into the British Isles and Ireland for these sources mostly. So I previously noted that Troy Books is an excellent source for this, as well as Three Hands Press, because you'll get lots and lots of books. This is an amazing book that I love. This is the British Book of Spells and Charms by Graham King. And this essentially is a little bit like A.D. Mercer's The Cottage Witch, that it's just a collection of these charms, and it includes some pictures of examples of those charms that are at the museum itself. So it's almost like a little guidebook to some of them. It's a really, really fantastic book. I love this. So a lot of the charms that are listed, there's the abracadabra charm, there's the status square, there's witches' ladders to cure a sore throat, stopping the flow of blood. Hoofer quotes this charm in his Book of Witches in 1908. Again, Cornish charms, snake bites, sciatica, removing curses. There are loads and loads of spells and charms and divinations for love, regaining a lover. This image here of the popular Halloween motif where a woman would look into the glass and your future husband's fate will pass. Cornish folklorist William Painter in the early 1900s. So there's loads here. So interesting, lovely to read, just fantastic to have to dip in and out of. There's so many things that you can bring into your practice, which I love. That's why I just love folk magic, folk witchcraft, because it's so deep. And again, as I said, you can bring it together with your hearth magic, hearth witchcraft, and they encompass each other for me. I would also just like to say as well that last year I did do a series of Sabbat videos, and I would like to continue next year perhaps with the earlier Sabbats, because last year as I went through I started to go deeper and I read the Stations of the Sun, and I found that as I was going through this there was so much of a collection of folklore in here, and all of course cited as well. Might have been in books, in literature, some of it was in magazines, but all recorded. So there's the historical fact there, and because Ronald Hutton is a respected historian, you know, this is a really, really good source to cite. So I am currently reading this book, which I am absolutely loving. I listed this as one of the books that I wanted to read this year because I picked it up. I got it for Christmas. It's so funny, all of my books have like this little nibble out of them because my little pussycat has been nibbling them when they've been on my bedside table, or like when they've been on the floor like they are now because I'm showing them to you. So this is the Black Book of Isobel Gowdie and Other Scottish Spells and Charms. So this goes into the history of Isobel Gowdie, what we know about her, although we don't know her fate. There is the guess there of what did happen to her according to what has happened to most people. She has some extensive trial records that she has given, and she is known famously to have given like the most from her confessions, and some argue that she was a real witch because of it. Some argue that, you know, it was done under torture, so potentially not. One thing that I think is really, really interesting is that there's potential that she and her coven mates or peers may have been suffering with some form of psychosis, and that may have been due to intoxicated grain. So this is Veneficium by Daniel A. Shulk, and in this section, The Witch's Supper, this is actually delved into that in centuries past, white flour was a privilege of the wealthy, and poorer classes resorted to eating the so-called black breads made of rye and barley, which also contained a manner of adulterants from the harvest. So Pierre Camperossi, in his Bread of Dreams, has speculated that the psychoactive contaminants of grain such as darnel, Lolium termentulum, and ergot, Claviceps purpura, I'm so sorry if I've said that wrong, were so common in the flowers of some regions and areas that the average peasant was in a constant state of intoxication. If true, the evidence cited by Camperossi suggests that the psychoactivity of such breads was an accidental byproduct of a fouled food supply, but if the phenomena was understood by herbalists and magical practitioners, there would be little to stop the cunning from crafting experimental loaves. Kitchen witchery. So then there is the old term crow's bread, originates in the founding lineages of witchcraft, of the witchcraft order Cultus Sabbati, and originally referred to as the intoxicating mushroom psilocybin semanticera, as the gift of the spirits for visionary ritual use. So there's talk about psychoactive ritual substances, there's talk about the infernal supper, the witch's supper, abominable meats and bones and breads that were consumed, including black bread and crow's bread. So I really think that this is highly interesting. So as you read different topics relating to the folk magic, you can start to piece things together. So this was like penny dropping for me when considering Isobel Gowdie. Going back to this book, I really enjoyed this. So it talks about Isobel Gowdie at the start, and then there's the Black Book of Isobel Gowdie, which is like a compilation of the charms that were penned from the trial records, and so Ash has put these together. I think also I do want to make a note that there are healing charms as well as some quite painful charms, and some of them make my skin crawl a little bit, like, you know, cursing the children of one's enemy, things like that. That whether or not she was trialed under torture, you know, these confessions were forced, potentially there was that, you know, psychoactive element there to it, and that she was intoxicated. But also you have to consider the cultural mores, the times, and there is a potential that these were ways in which these people survived from being treated badly or threatened by others. So again, it's a little bit like we wouldn't do that now, but we don't really know what conditions these people were under. So trying to just check my judgment there, because it's a byproduct of the culture and the society that they were part of. So just make that note. So after the Black Book of Isobel Gowdie, you have Spells and Charms of the Accused, and it's interesting here that Ash notes that Owen Davies writes in the article titled Comparative Perspective on Scottish Cunning Folk and Charmers that there were more charmers and wise men and women convicted under Scottish witchcraft than those in England, and that is because the Scottish statute made no distinctions between beneficial magic and witchcraft, and they were understood to be the same crime. So that's really interesting. And then the next section includes other Scottish charms and spells which were collected together from folklorists between the 18th and 20th centuries, and unlike those in the previous section, these spells and charms were not extracted from those who were convicted under the Witchcraft Acts in previous centuries. In my opinion, Ash's opinion, since the practice of folk magic was no longer prohibited during this time, these spells and charms hold more authenticity as they were not tainted by possible false confession. So that's not to say that the oral collectors of these charms and spells were innocent of falsifying material, and I implore great caution regarding some early folklorists. Even Alexander Carmichael was guilty of altering the original transcripts in his final publication of the Carmina Gadelica for the sake of romanticisation during the second wave of the Celtic revival in Britain. So Alexander Carmichael's The Carmina Gadelica is an interesting piece of folklore that I would like to get my hands on. I have not yet, but I know that others do work with it. Ash has spent a very long time studying this, over 25 years of experience regarding Scottish and Irish folklore, witchcraft and magic, has a degree in Celtic Studies and Heritage, and currently studying Scottish ethnology and history at the University of Edinburgh, Animist and folk magic practitioner. So they have a lot of wisdom, and I really loved this book. It's quite interesting that Ash has just thrown in, almost like for good measure, the Spaewife or Universal Fortune Teller, wherein your fortune welfare may be known by physiognomy, cards, palmistry and coffee grounds. Also a distinct treatise on moles by an astrologer. I'm not sure what that part is, but maybe I'll understand that when I get to it. Essentially, this was a chapbook on fortune telling that was so popular during the 19th century Scotland, and several publications were released. This is in the public domain, and Ash just threw this in, and I think it's really great because I am currently deepening my practice with playing cards, using playing card cartomancy for divination alongside the Lenormand as well, and incorporating bone throwing and charm casting with that as well, and I'm finding it so interesting, and it's really predictive. It's really like straight to the point. Not that, you know, I'm dismissing the validity of tarot either, because I'm still using my tarot. In fact, I did a tarot spread yesterday that was really revealing about a particular situation I'm in that I was all over the place about, and now I'm much clearer. I've got a lot of understanding about the nuances, the ins and outs of this situation, the way it is, and so I know exactly what I'm doing now thanks to the tarot. But it's very in and out and dancey, whereas like with the playing cards you just get like a straight answer. It's just boom 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 boom. So I'm really enjoying that, and so this is really good to have as well. So love this book. Obviously, I've talked about Gemma Gary's Silent as the Trees, which I absolutely loved, which is folklore in Devon. And then, of course, there's Traditional Witchcraft, Cornish Book of Ways. I would highly recommend those. Start there if you're interested in folk magic from the British Isles. Really handy. I picked this up. This is The Witchcraft and Folklore of Dartmoor by Ruth E. Ledger. I've dipped in and out of this, but this was as a response to reading the Silent as the Trees by Gemma Gary, because this was listed in the bibliography, and it's so interesting because there's so many areas of Dartmoor that are really haunted. So this is really interesting for deepening that knowledge and understanding about the folklore there. The Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries by Evan Wentz if you're interested in working with fair folk or brownies or house spirits. This is like essential folkloric reading. There's also Plants, Lore and Legends by Richard Fulcard there. Carl Pepper's Complete Herbal down there. There's Paul Cedar's Occult Botany over there. There are a number of herbal remedy books that I have that I will show you a few right now. Kind of can't stop with the herbal remedies, they're just everywhere. So there's a few over here. I have the Natural Remedy Bible by Michael Tira and John Lust. Then there is the Grandma's Remedies by Cherry Chappell. This is Gardeners, Magic and Other Old Wives' Lore by Bridget Rowland. Again, this was in a bibliography. I think maybe it was Corine Boyer's bibliography. So practical old wives' lore for protecting your garden, animals in the garden, when walking in the garden. So it's just a little one to dip in and out of. It's drawing folkloric customs and information from across the world actually. So it's not just specific, but it's all specific to gardening. Just one that you can have maybe when you're considering what to plant where. These books also almost escaped my attention. I was going to share these with you. So this is Discovering the Folklore of Plants by Margaret Baker. And this was published in 1969. Again, includes quite a lot of like a collection. It's like a herbal and a collection of different folklore, a little bit like Nigel G. Pearson's Wortcunning. Got the mandragora on the front. And this one's a really good one for Irish plants. There's another one over there as well, which is The Healing Power of Celtic Plants by Angela Payne, but this is a older one. This is Irish Country Cures, and this was first published by Patrick Logan in 1981. And again, drawing on folk medicine, different superstitions, and these are all from Ireland. So again, really interesting. So just adding these two different sources that you might wish to get your hands on and read. I have The Discovery of Witchcraft by Reginald Scott down there, which is quite difficult to read. I also have Jim Baker's A Cunning Man's Handbook over there, which is also quite a tough read, so I dip in and out of that one. This one, Operative Witchcraft, this is one that I have on my list to read this year. I've heard that this is pretty good. This is Nigel Pennick, and I believe Nigel Pennick has some more works about folkloric witchcraft, also supposed to be very good. So this is Operative Witchcraft, Spellwork and Herbcraft in the British Isles. So in this practical guide, Nigel Pennick takes the reader on a journey through the practice of operative witchcraft in the British Isles from the Middle Ages and the Elizabethan era to the decriminalisation of witchcraft in the 1950s and its practice today. So it's talking about English traditions, fetches, witches' familiars, animal magic, forms of witchcraft practiced by rural tradespeople such as blacksmiths, herbalists, artisans. So again, folk people. Folk incantations, spells, charms, magical uses of herbs, nightshades, amulets, sigils, protection against the evil eye, aromatic oils, etc. So it's operative witchcraft, and that's essentially what it is. So, and that's one of the reasons why, again, I do believe that you should be able to practice whether or not you have a faith. And isn't this interesting? I opened it up, and Darnel is this plant here, what we're discussing. The grass called Darnel, Lolium tumlentum, sometimes grew among wheat or rye fields. If Darnel grains were present in the milling process, then the brain contained the active substance of ergot alkaloids that produces vertigo, violent tremors of the limbs, loss of strength, and visual impairment that makes everything appear green. Darnel is a plant that takes one to the green other world, though it is extremely dangerous to use it in this way. So potentially our witches who were accused of witchcraft, who were in Isobel Gowdie's coven, were in fact intoxicated with Darnel. So incredibly vital to read and read and read and read and then keep reading, and just everything you learn is just, oh, it's so interesting. This is Operative Witchcraft. It's not one I've read yet, dipped in and out of, and I'm planning to read the entire thing cover to cover this year. So really key and interesting. I listed this one as one of my favourite books from last year. Oh my gosh, I think it might be my favourite for a very, very long time. This is A Deed Without a Name, Unearthing Legacy of Traditional Witchcraft by Lee Morgan. This is all about your fetch, your familiar, and discovering your fetch and familiar, and it taps into core shamanism. It pulls upon trial records, folklore, modern testimonials, so there's quite a few of those. And for me, what I said in my review, I do feel this opened up new layers of inquiry for me with regards to my practice when it comes to hedge riding and astral travel and spirit flight, and also shape-shifting. That's a big thing, right? So although this says traditional witchcraft, this is an area that overlaps into the folk witchcraft because it's something that was done, you know, spirit flight, the Sabbatic Witchcraft. In the witch trials, that's what Isobel Gowdie claims that she did, that she communed with the devil and that she flew. Again, really, really highly, I love this book. I highly recommend this book. As I mentioned, you've got so many herbal remedy books that are compilations of herbal remedies, like that are more modern, that have been put together, or you have actual folkloric texts like Richard Folkard's or like Cold Peppers. I absolutely love Corine Boyer's Plants of the Devil. Again, there's lots in there, just like in Veneficium. We're learning about these baneful herbs and also the folklore around these plants and why they're associated with the devil. And again, you've got lots and lots of allusions to Samhain and to Halloween and to love divinations that were performed on that night, or even on the night of Beltane. These times the veil was thinnest and where it was easier and more common to cross over into the other world, or to be able to see the ghost or the vision of your future spouse, etc. And there's more of these in the Dream Divination Plants by Corine Boyer. This is a teeny tiny book and I absolutely love it. Corine Boyer, essential reading, essential author for anyone interested in herbalism, occult herbalism, folkloric magic, folkloric witchcraft, just absolutely essential. So good. I love this book. There's so much on mugwort and Damiana, like my favourites, and there's a couple of really, really beautiful recipes as well. A mugwort salve here at the end that Corine adds. But this is 3 hands press. I would highly recommend. I think maybe Corine Boyer's books, a couple of them are going out of print. I have yet to read Under the Witching Tree and Under the Bramble Arch and The Witch's Cabinet. Those are very high on my list though, and I'll be getting through them soon. Nigel G. Pearson, another fantastic author from Troy Books. This is a Troy book, and Treading the Mill as well, another one. Really, really recommend for traditional witchcraft specifically, but again, it goes into elements of folkloric practice and magic. So this is Wortcunning. This is a folk medicine herbal. One side of it is structured where you have a list of each plant, herb, and then notes about it, so what it can be used for, also the specifics about the plant. And then on the other side it goes into further depth about actual applications of the plant, so how you can use them, the other names for the plant as well, and their planetary associations as well as their Latin names. I've got so many notes all through this book. I absolutely love it. This is a lovely one to just take with you. Highly recommend. So if you are just dipping your toe into this, I would not get overwhelmed. I wouldn't go out and buy a book like Cottage Witchcraft or the Hearth Witchcraft book. I would avoid the more mass-produced books, apart from maybe a few, but I would dive deep into Troy Books, 3 hands press, look for authors Gemma Gary, look for Nigel Pennick, look for Nigel G. Pearson, look for Kobe Michael, the author of The Poison Path, look for Brian Hoggard, The Magical House Protection, look for old folk loric texts such as the ones I've listed, the Comedy Gadelica, Occult Botany, Jim Baker's Cunning Woman, Plant Lore Legends and Lyrics by Richard Folkard, the Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries, Nicholas Culpepper's Herbals, perfect for this. Lee Morgan, The Wicked Child of Kay by A.D. Mercer, Folk Witchcraft by Roger J. Horne. And if you're interested in diving deeper into traditional witchcraft, you could look into Shani Oates, you can look into Andrew Chumbley, look into Robert Cochrane, learn about these people and learn about their traditions. You might want to dip your toe into the Red Thread Academy. There's so many. It really, really depends on where you want to go, what you want to learn about. And so start with whatever you're the most passionate about. So if it's herbs because you like herb crafting or incorporating herbs within your kitchen witchery, then look into the herbal remedies and look into Nigel G. Pearson's book first and Corine Boyer's books, because they are based in the herb craft, right? Or if you want to get deeper into more of a sabbatic kind of traditional witchcraft, then go into Shani Oates's work, etc. And just dive in, learn, discover. If you're interested in learning about Scotland, you know, obviously Ash's Black Book of Isobel Gowdie, the Comedy Gadelica. There's just so many areas in which you could go. I would also highly recommend The Witch's Sabbath and Crooked Path by Kelden. Those mass-produced books, and I would highly recommend those. Yeah, really, really good books. I don't think you can go wrong with Gemma Gary either. Just chef's kiss for these authors, and I'm so grateful that they have produced the work that they have. I would also recommend as well, there is Philip Cargom's Book of English Magic as well, you could go into, because that has a lot of folklore and history in it, as well as of course Ronald Hutton and historians such as Ronald Hutton who are going into these depths. Like Brian Hoggard is a historian. So I have really, really dived deep into this. I feel I may have lost some people in this as well, and that's absolutely fine. Also, I am absolutely open to hearing other interpretations, other quotes maybe that you have read in other books or that you've picked up that I've forgotten to mention, specific charms or approaches to charms or psalms or anything that you, any nuggets of wisdom or things that go through your mind or things that you've been reading recently that come to mind. I really encourage you to write them below. And also if you have any other thoughts that I've not suggested, or if you have any questions as well for me, please list them below. Highly grateful to my subscriber for leaving this comment. I would say their name, but I'm not sure if I have permission to do so, so I'm not going to unless they say, then I can give them credit for the question. But I'm so grateful for the question, and thank you again so much for joining me. I hope that you've enjoyed this. I hope that it's been educational and interesting. I've really enjoyed filming. So if you enjoyed the video, please do like it, share it, and if you are enjoying my content and you're not yet subscribed, please do subscribe and hit the little bell notification so you'll be notified when I create and upload videos just like this. Also, if you enjoyed the video, please do leave me a little plant emoji as well. That would be gorgeous to see. Again, as I said, comment. That's really what I want to see from you. I want to hear your thoughts and feedback and ideas and quotes and yeah, musings. And also how you practice. I want to know how you practice. That would be awesome. If you'd like to support me, I have an Instagram page, I have a TikTok. The Instagram is more active though. I also have a Patreon page where I share new and full moon forecasts with planetary aspects, how to work with them, as well as shadow work, journal prompts, different rituals and practices that you can perform, engage with, herbs and crystals that you can work with during the lunation to support you in your practice, as well as a custom made tarot spread for that lunation as well. I share all of that on Patreon, and I'm sharing sort of an overview on my YouTube channel as a video forecast and on Instagram as well. So if you would like the access to the full forecast over on Patreon, do join me over there. We have a Discord server as well, and I'm occasionally sharing Book of Shadows pages with recipes and spells and rituals that I share on the channel as well. So if you're interested, do click over and join us on Patreon. As I said, there's Instagram as well, and if you'd just like to show your support with a one-time donation, that is the super thanks below. There's also a buy me a coffee page, and then there's a direct PayPal link as well, so that's there if you wish to show your gratitude for the time and energy and effort I put into these videos, because I really do, but it is a labour of love because yeah, I love it so much. So thank you again so much for being here. I am wishing you a beautiful day wherever you are, whatever you're doing. Take care, stay safe, and I look forward to seeing you again in another video really soon. Many blessings. Mwah.